My son threw me out of my own house and moved his mother-in-law into my bedroom, but what he didn't know was that I owned every single brick of that $2 million property, and his arrogance was about to cost him everything. My name is Ruth Patterson. I'm 82 years old, and I've been on this earth long enough to know that blood doesn't always mean loyalty. I spent 63 years married to my Walter, building a life together, raising 3 children in a beautiful 4-bedroom house in Seattle that I bought with my inheritance money back in 1978. Walter passed 5 years ago, leaving me a widow at 77. I thought my golden years would be peaceful, surrounded by family in the home where we'd celebrated 50 anniversaries, where we'd watched our children grow, where every corner held a memory of the man I loved. I was wrong. 3 months ago, my son Cameron, my oldest, the one I'd always been closest to, looked me in the eye and told me I needed to move out. Not asked, told. He said his mother-in-law Diane needed my room because she had health problems, and that I should go live in a senior community where I'd be happier with people my age. When I refused, he got angry. When I stood my ground, he got vicious. Last Friday, I came home from a doctor's appointment to find my belongings packed in boxes on the sidewalk, my clothes, my photos of Walter, my entire life dumped on the curb like garbage while neighbors watched. Cameron stood there with 2 large men and told me the house was his now, that I either left voluntarily or he'd call the police to remove me for trespassing. I was 82 years old, sitting on that curb with tears in my eyes, watching Diane arrive with 20 Louis Vuitton suitcases and walk into my home like she owned it. That's when I made a phone call that would change everything. If you want to hear how a grandmother who supposedly had nothing fought back against the son who betrayed her, stay with me. This story has more turns than Cameron ever saw coming, and I promise you justice tastes sweeter when you've waited 82 years to serve it. Hit that subscribe button, because this is one family drama you won't want to miss. Looking back now, I can see the first crack appeared about 6 months after Walter died. At the time, I thought I was just grieving, maybe being too sensitive, but no, my instincts were right all along. I just didn't want to believe my own son could be plotting against me. Walter's funeral was beautiful. All 3 of our children were there, Cameron, David, and Sarah, along with 12 grandchildren, and half the neighborhood. We'd lived in that house for 47 years. People remembered Walter building the back deck with his own hands, remembered the summer barbecues, remembered how he'd helped fix their cars or give financial advice. My Walter was generous with his knowledge and his time, maybe too generous. Maybe that's where Cameron learned that generosity meant weakness. After the funeral, Cameron and his wife Jennifer sat me down in my own living room. They'd been living with me for 26 years at that point, supposedly temporarily, until they got established. But temporary became permanent once the grandkids came. I never minded. I loved having family around, loved hearing my grandchildren's laughter echoing through the rooms where their father had grown up. Cameron put his hand on mine that day, his voice all soft and concerned, and told me he was worried about me living alone. He said the house was too big for one person, that I might fall and no one would find me, that at 77, I shouldn't be dealing with maintenance and upkeep. He offered to take over managing the property, handling repairs, dealing with contractors. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor. I should have seen it then, but I was drowning in grief, missing Walter so much I could barely breathe some days, and Cameron's offer felt like love, like he was stepping up to take care of his mother, the way Walter had always taken care of me. So I said yes. I said he could handle the house maintenance, could coordinate repairs, could make decisions about landscaping and contractors. That was my first mistake. Within 2 months, Cameron had changed all the locks. He said it was for security, that the old locks were outdated, that he'd gotten a great deal on a modern system. He gave me new keys, and I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? It was my house. My name on the deed since 1978, bought with inheritance money from my parents before Walter and I even married. That house was mine, and I'd never signed anything giving Cameron any claim to it. But Cameron started acting like he owned it anyway. He'd make decisions without telling me. I'd come home from my weekly bridge game to find contractors tearing out the kitchen cabinets Walter had installed 30 years ago. When I asked what was happening, Cameron would wave his hand dismissively and tell me not to worry, that the kitchen needed updating, that he was adding value to the property, to my property, using my money. I found out later he'd somehow gotten access to my household account, the one I used for utilities and maintenance. Jennifer started treating me differently too. Before Walter died, she'd been pleasant enough, a bit materialistic, always wanting newer cars and designer handbags, but I figured that was just her way. After Walter passed, though, she began making little comments. She'd sigh heavily if I left a dish in the sink, like I was some messy teenager, instead of the woman who owned the house she was living in rent. She'd complain that I walked too heavily on the stairs, that I watched my television too loud, that I needed to be more considerate of their family's schedule, their family, in my house. I bit my tongue. I told myself I was being oversensitive, that grief was making me paranoid, that they were just stressed with 3 kids and busy careers. David and Sarah, my other children, lived out of state. David was in Portland with his own family, Sarah in Denver. They'd call weekly, ask how I was doing, but they weren't there to see the small ways Cameron was pushing me into corners of my own home. The real shift came about 3 months ago. Jennifer's mother, Diana, a woman who'd never worked a day in her life, who'd been living comfortably off her late husband's pension, suddenly developed mysterious health problems. I say mysterious because they kept changing. First it was her heart, then her knees, then some vague neurological thing no doctor could quite diagnose. But Diane needed family care. Jennifer insisted. Diane couldn't possibly live alone anymore. Cameron came to my bedroom one evening, my bedroom, in my house, sat on the edge of my bed like he was the parent and I was the child. He told me they'd found a wonderful senior living community just 20 minutes away. Sunrise, Senior Living, he said. Beautiful place, lots of activities, people my own age to socialize with. Wouldn't I be happier there instead of rattling around in this big old house? I stared at my son, this man I'd given birth to 54 years ago. This boy I'd rocked when he had nightmares and nursed through chickenpox and put through college, and I said very clearly that I wasn't going anywhere. This was my home. Walter and I had built our life here. I'd planted every rosebush in that garden. I'd chosen every paint color. I'd raised my children in these rooms, and I planned to live here until I died. Cameron's face went hard. He stood up, looked down at me with this cold expression I'd never seen before, and told me I was being selfish. He said Diane was sick and needed the ground floor bedroom, my bedroom, because she couldn't handle stairs. He said I had 4 bedrooms and was only using one, that it was wasteful and inconsiderate. I reminded him that the other 3 bedrooms were occupied by him, Jennifer, and their children. That I didn't have 4 bedrooms to myself, had 1 room in my own house. He left without another word, but I heard him downstairs telling Jennifer that I was being difficult, that I was getting stubborn in my old age, that they'd have to handle this another way. That's when I knew. Sitting there in my bedroom at 77 years old, hands shaking, heart pounding, I finally understood what was happening. My son wasn't trying to help me. He was trying to get rid of me, and the worst part, he actually believed he had the right to do it. After that conversation with Cameron, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me, the same creaks and groans I'd heard for 47 years. Sounds as familiar as my own heartbeat. Walter used to joke that the house was talking to us, telling us its stories. That night, I wished he was there to help me understand what was happening. But Walter was gone, and I was on my own. The next morning, I waited until Cameron and Jennifer left for work and the grandkids went to school. Then, I went into Walter's old study, the room that had become Cameron's home office, without anyone asking my permission, and I started looking through papers. I'm not proud of going through my son's things. My generation was raised to respect privacy, to trust family, but something in my gut told me I needed to know what I was dealing with. And after 63 years of marriage, to a man who taught me everything about real estate and property management, I knew exactly what documents to look for. It took me 3 hours, but I found them. Tucked in the back of Cameron's filing cabinet, behind folders labeled taxes and insurance, was a manila envelope that made my blood run cold. Inside were property assessment documents for my house, recent ones, from just 2 months ago. The house was valued at $2.3 million. I knew that already. What I didn't know was that Cameron had been shopping for mortgage lenders. There were pre-approval letters addressed to him, applications for home equity lines of credit, documents discussing property inheritance timeline and estate acceleration options. My hands started shaking so badly, I almost dropped the papers. Cameron was planning to borrow against my house. My house, the one that was in my name, that I'd owned for 47 years, that he had absolutely no legal claim to. He'd been meeting with banks, with financial advisors, discussing how to access the equity in a property he didn't own. But that wasn't even the worst part. At the bottom of the envelope was a draft document, and I had to read it 3 times before I could believe what I was seeing. It was a quitclaim deed, a legal form that would transfer ownership of my property from me to Cameron. The deed was filled out completely, dated for execution upon incapacity or voluntary transfer, and it had a space for my signature that wasn't there yet. But the document was ready and waiting. I sat down hard in Walter's old desk chair, the leather cracked and worn from decades of use, and I tried to breathe. My son had prepared paperwork to take my house. He was just waiting for the right moment, waiting for me to become incapacitated, or waiting to convince me to sign it, or God knows what else he might have been planning. I thought about all the times in recent months when Cameron had suggested I was getting forgetful. Little comments here and there about how I'd repeated a story, how I'd forgotten what day it was, how I'd missed a doctor's appointment I swear I never made. At the time, I'd worried maybe he was right, maybe I was slipping. I'm 82 years old, it happens, but now I wondered if he'd been building a narrative, creating a story of incompetence that he could use later to justify taking everything from me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might have a heart attack right there in his office. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to throw those papers in his face and demand an explanation. But I'd learned something from Walter's years in business. Never show your hand before you know the whole game. I took photos of every document with my phone. It took me 20 minutes to figure out how to do it properly. These old eyes and these new technologies don't always cooperate, but I managed. Then I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. Cameron couldn't know that I knew. Not yet. Over the next week, I started paying closer attention to everything. I noticed that Cameron had been telling people I was declining. He'd mentioned to the neighbors that I was having some memory issues, that he was worried about me living independently. He'd told his siblings, my own children, that I was getting confused more often, that maybe we needed to talk about next steps for Mom's care. David called me from Portland, his voice concerned, asking if I was feeling all right. He said Cameron had mentioned I'd gotten lost driving home from the grocery store last week. I hadn't. I'd gone straight there and straight back, same route I'd driven for 40 years. But Cameron had planted the seed, and now my other children were wondering if their mother was losing her mind. Jennifer's part in this became clearer too. She'd been pushing the Diane situation harder and harder, making it seem like this emergency that required immediate action. But I did some digging, called a friend whose daughter works at the hospital, and found out that Diane had been seen exactly once in the past 6 months, for routine blood work that came back completely normal. There was no health crisis. There never had been. This whole thing was a setup. Get Diane into the house as an excuse to get me out. Once I was gone, Cameron would have total control. He'd probably wait a few months, then produce those incapacity documents, or convince me to sign something while I was confused. And by the time anyone realized what happened, he'd own my house, and my life savings would be his to access. Sitting in my bedroom that night, surrounded by photos of Walter and our life together, I made a decision. I was 82 years old, but I wasn't helpless. I wasn't confused, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let my own son steal everything Walter and I had built. But I needed help. I needed someone who understood property law and elder rights. I needed someone who could move fast if things went bad. I opened my old address book, the physical kind, the one I'd kept for 40 years, and found the number for Vincent Torres. Vincent had been Walter's real estate attorney since 1987. He'd handled every property transaction we'd ever made, had been at Walter's funeral, had sent me a beautiful card afterward saying if I ever needed anything to call him. I picked up the phone with trembling fingers and dialed his number. When his secretary answered, I said I needed to speak with Vincent urgently about protecting my property rights. She put me through immediately, and Vincent's warm voice came on the line asking what he could do for me. I took a deep breath and told him my son was trying to steal my house, and I needed to know exactly where I stood legally. Vincent went quiet for a moment, then asked me to come to his office the next morning and bring any documents I had. He said something in his tone that made me feel less alone for the first time in months. He said we'd make sure no one took what was rightfully mine. That was 1 week before Cameron threw me out on the sidewalk. 1 week before everything exploded. But in that moment, sitting in my bedroom with Vincent's reassurance still warm in my ear, I didn't know how fast Cameron would move, or how vicious he'd become. I didn't know that my son was capable of physically removing his own mother from her home. But I was about to find out just how far he'd go, and he was about to learn that underestimating an 82-year-old woman with a good lawyer was the biggest mistake of his life. I met with Vincent Torres the next morning at his office downtown. I brought every document I'd photographed, along with my original property deed from 1978, the one I kept in my safety deposit box at the bank. The one Cameron didn't even know existed. Vincent spent 2 hours going through everything. He's 71 himself, been practicing real estate law for over 40 years, and I watched his face get more and more serious as he read through Cameron's paperwork. Finally, he looked up at me over his reading glasses and said I was in a very dangerous position. He explained that while Cameron had no legal right to my property, he'd clearly been building a case for my incompetence. If Cameron could get even one doctor to sign off on cognitive decline, he could petition for conservatorship. Once he had that, he could make all my financial decisions, could sell my house, could move me anywhere he wanted. And from what Vincent could see in those documents, that was exactly Cameron's plan. Vincent asked if I'd signed any powers of attorney recently. I hadn't. Walter and I had set those up 30 years ago with David as our primary agent, specifically because we knew Cameron was too impulsive with money. But Vincent warned me that Cameron might try to get me to sign something, might present it as a simple update or routine paperwork. He told me to be very careful, to sign nothing without calling him first, and to document everything Cameron did or said. He also said something that chilled me to the bone. If Cameron was desperate enough, he might escalate quickly. Vincent had seen cases where family members manufactured emergencies to force elderly relatives out of their homes, then claimed squatters' rights or forged documents while the person was displaced. I went home that afternoon with Vincent's card in my purse and a small voice recorder he'd given me. He said Washington is a two-party consent state for recordings, so I couldn't use them in court without Cameron's knowledge, but they'd help me keep track of what was said. Sometimes, Vincent told me, elderly clients forget the exact words used against them, and abusers count on that. I decided to play the role Cameron expected. If he thought I was declining, I'd let him think he was right. If he thought I was confused and helpless, I'd give him just enough rope to hang himself with. That week was the hardest performance of my life. Cameron would make his little comments about my memory, and instead of defending myself like I wanted to, I'd pause and look uncertain. I'd say things like, "Oh dear, did I really repeat that story?" Or "I could have sworn today was Wednesday." I watched my son's confidence grow with every confused look I gave him. Jennifer got bolder too. She started going through my jewelry box while I was supposedly napping, holding up pieces and asking if I really needed all these old things. She suggested I might want to give some items to the granddaughters now instead of making them wait. She picked up my mother's pearl necklace, the one I'd worn at my wedding to Walter, and commented that it would look beautiful on their youngest daughter for prom next year. I smiled vaguely and said maybe we could talk about it later. And I watched Jennifer's eyes light up like she'd already won. The breaking point came 4 days after my meeting with Vincent. I came home from my doctor's appointment, a regular checkup, where my doctor told me I was sharp as a tack and healthy as a horse. For 82 on, Cameron was waiting in the living room with a very serious expression. He sat me down and explained that he and Jennifer had found the perfect place for me. Sunrise Senior Living, the same place he'd mentioned before. He had brochures spread out on the coffee table, glossy photos of smiling elderly people doing crafts and playing bingo. He told me they'd already toured it, that they'd put down a deposit to hold a room, that I could move in as early as next week. I asked, what about Diane? What about her needing care here at the house? Cameron waved that away and said they'd figured out a solution. Diane would take my ground floor bedroom, and I'd be much happier with people my own age, in a place designed for seniors. His face was so earnest, so caring. If I hadn't seen those documents in his office, if I hadn't known what he was planning, I might have believed he actually thought he was helping me. I played my part. I said I didn't know, that it was all so sudden, that I needed time to think. Cameron's jaw tightened just slightly. I saw it, that flash of frustration when things weren't moving as fast as he wanted. He told me we didn't have much time, that Diane was getting worse, that the room at Sunrise wouldn't stay available forever. Jennifer came in then with a stack of papers. She said they'd already filled out most of the application for Sunrise, that I just needed to sign a few things. She put the papers in front of me with a pen, pointing to the signature lines. I picked up the first page, squinting at it like my eyes were bothering me, and I saw exactly what Vincent had warned me about. Buried in the middle of the Sunrise Senior Living application was a medical power of attorney form, giving Cameron complete authority over my healthcare decisions. Another page gave him financial power of attorney. A third was an authorization for him to access all my bank accounts. They'd hidden it in the middle of what looked like routine admission paperwork, betting I wouldn't read carefully or wouldn't understand what I was signing. I set the pen down with shaking hands. That part wasn't acting and told them I wanted my lawyer to look at everything first. Cameron's face went dark. He said I didn't need a lawyer, that this was just standard paperwork, that I was being paranoid and difficult. Jennifer's mask slipped for just a second. She snapped that they were trying to help me, that I was being ungrateful, that maybe I wasn't capable of making good decisions anymore if I couldn't see they were looking out for my best interests. I stood up slowly, like my joints hurt. Even though I'd been doing yoga twice a week for the past decade and was more flexible than Jennifer and told them I was tired and needed to rest. Cameron tried to press the issue, but I shuffled off to my bedroom and closed the door. I heard them arguing in the living room. Cameron's voice was angry, saying they were running out of time, that they needed to move faster. Jennifer said something about just doing it anyway, that I'd forgive them eventually, once I was settled at Sunrise, and they had everything handled. That's when I knew Cameron was about to make his move. The pressure was building, the manipulation wasn't working fast enough, and desperate people do desperate things. I called Vincent from my bedroom and told him what had just happened. He asked if I had somewhere safe I could stay for a few days, maybe with David or Sarah. I told him they were both out of town. David was on a business trip to Tokyo. Sarah was on vacation in Mexico with her family. I'd checked before, and Cameron knew they'd both be unreachable for another week. He'd timed this perfectly. Vincent told me to pack a bag and keep it ready, to make copies of all my important documents, and to call him immediately if anything escalated. He said he'd start drafting protection orders, but we needed evidence of imminent threat before a judge would grant them. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat on my bed, the bed Walter and I had shared for 63 years, and I let myself cry, not because I was scared, although I was, not because I felt helpless, although part of me did. I cried because this was my son, my firstborn. The baby I'd nursed through colic and celebrated at every birthday and put through college and welcomed into my home for 26 years. And he was trying to take everything from me. But crying didn't change anything. Walter used to say that tears were fine, as long as you dried them and got back to work. So that's what I did. I dried my face, straightened my shoulders, and I waited. Cameron made his move 2 days later, the day I came home to find my life packed in boxes on the sidewalk. And that's when he learned that the confused, helpless old woman he thought he was pushing around had been 10 steps ahead of him the entire time. I'll never forget that Friday afternoon. I'd gone to my regular doctor's appointment, the one where Dr. Martinez told me my blood pressure was perfect and my mind was sharp as ever. I even asked her to document that in my file, told her I might need it for legal purposes. She looked concerned and asked if everything was all right. I just smiled and said I was being cautious. When my rideshare dropped me off at home around 3 o'clock, I saw Cameron's truck in the driveway along with a large moving van I didn't recognize. My stomach dropped. I knew. Before I even reached the front walk, I knew what I was going to find. My belongings were stacked on the sidewalk, not carefully packed, just thrown into garbage bags and cardboard boxes. I saw my clothes spilling out, my photo albums, my mother's china that had survived 3 generations, 47 years of life reduced to trash bags on the curb, while neighbors slowed their cars to stare. Cameron stood on the porch with 2 large men I'd never seen before. They looked like the kind of people you hire when you want to intimidate someone. My son, my own son, had brought muscle to throw out his 82-year-old mother. I walked up slowly, my heart pounding, and asked what was happening. Cameron's face was hard, no trace of the boy I'd raised. He told me they'd had enough of my stubbornness, that Diane needed the space, and I was being selfish. He said he'd given me chances to leave peacefully, and I'd refused, so now he was making the decision for me. I reminded him this was my house. He actually laughed, this cold, ugly sound I'd never heard from him before. He said the house was his now, that I'd lived here long enough, that Dad would have wanted him to have it. He said I could go to Sunrise Senior Living, like they'd arranged, or I could figure something else out. but either way, I wasn't coming back inside. When I tried to walk past him to my front door, he physically blocked me. This man I'd carried inside my body for 9 months, who I'd held when he was minutes old, who I'd sacrificed everything for, he looked me in the eye and told me if I didn't leave, he'd call the police and have me arrested for trespassing. In my own home, one of the big men stepped forward like he might grab me if I resisted. I'm 5'3" and weigh maybe 110 pounds. These were men who could have broken me in half. That's when I saw Diane's car pulling up. A luxury SUV Cameron had probably paid for with my money. She had enough luggage to move in for a year, designer bags, the kind that cost more than some people's monthly rent. She walked past me without even looking at me, stepped over my mother's china sitting in a box on the sidewalk, and waltzed into my house like she'd been invited to a resort. Jennifer held the door open for her with this triumphant smile. She patted my shoulder as I stood there trembling and told me not to worry, that they'd take good care of the house. Like it was already decided, like I was already gone. Cameron handed me a piece of paper with an address on it, Sunrise Senior Living. He said they'd paid for the first month, that it was all arranged, that a driver would come pick me up in an hour. He said my things would be delivered once I was settled, but looking at the bags torn and scattered, I knew most of it would end up in the trash. I stood on that sidewalk where I'd watched my children learn to ride bikes, where Walter had proposed to me 59 years ago on our first date when he walked me home. I stood there with my whole life in garbage bags around me, and I pulled out my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial Vincent's number. When he answered, I said the words I never thought I'd have to say. Vincent, my son just threw me out of my own house. There was a pause, then Vincent's voice came through calm and steady. Ruth, stay right there. I'm calling the police and I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't move, don't sign anything. This ends today. Cameron heard me on the phone, and his face went pale for just a second before he covered it with anger. He told me I was making this harder than it needed to be, that lawyers wouldn't change the fact that he was in charge now, but I saw the first crack in his confidence, because somewhere in the back of his mind, my son was starting to wonder if maybe his helpless, confused old mother had been playing him all along. Those 20 minutes waiting on the sidewalk were the longest of my life. Neighbors were definitely watching now. Miss Chen from across the street came out pretending to get her mail. Mr. Rodriguez slowed his lawnmower to a crawl. Everyone could see Ruth Patterson, the woman who'd lived on this street since 1978, sitting on the curb, surrounded by trash bags of her belongings. Cameron went back inside like the matter was settled. Through the window, I could see Diane directing Jennifer where to put her things in my bedroom. My bedroom, the one where Walter died holding my hand, where I'd spent 5 years sleeping alone on his side of the bed because I couldn't bear the emptiness. I sat there on that curb with my old bones aching and my pride shattered, and I thought about all the times I'd sacrificed for Cameron. The college tuition I'd paid when he changed majors 3 times. The car I'd bought him when he totaled his at 23. The business loan I'd co-signed that he defaulted on, costing me $30,000 I never mentioned again. The rent-free living for 26 years. Every time, I'd told myself, that's what mothers do. You give and you expect nothing back except love and respect. But somewhere along the way, Cameron had learned to take my generosity as weakness. He'd mistaken my kindness for stupidity. A police car pulled up first, then Vincent's Mercedes right behind it. Vincent got out with his briefcase, and 2 uniformed officers followed him up the walkway. Vincent is a tall man, still imposing at 71, and he had this look on his face that made me glad he was on my side. He helped me up from the curb, his hand was steady and strong, and asked if I was hurt. I told him only my heart, and he patted my shoulder gently before turning toward my house with an expression that could freeze fire. Vincent rang the doorbell. When no one answered, he rang it again, then pounded on the door. Cameron finally opened it, looking annoyed, like we were interrupting his celebration. His face changed when he saw the police. Vincent introduced himself as my attorney and property rights representative. He stated very clearly that this house at 4720 Maple Street, Seattle, Washington, was solely owned by Ruth Marie Patterson, that the deed had been in my name continuously since June 1978, and that Cameron had no legal claim or right to remove me from my own property. Cameron started to argue, saying his father had left him the house. Vincent cut him off immediately. His voice was sharp and professional, the kind that makes people realize they're in serious trouble. He said Walter Patterson had never owned this house, that I'd purchased it with my inheritance before marriage, that it had remained separate property throughout our marriage as documented in our prenuptial agreement. I watched Cameron's face go from red to white. He stammered something about a will, about Dad's wishes. Vincent pulled documents from his briefcase, my original deed, the prenuptial agreement from 1963, property tax records showing continuous ownership in my name for 47 years. One of the officers asked Cameron if he had any documentation proving ownership. Cameron said he didn't need documentation, that he'd been living there for 26 years. The officer explained that didn't grant him ownership rights, that he'd been living there as a guest of the actual owner, me. Vincent then addressed the illegal eviction. He explained that Cameron had forcibly removed an 82-year-old woman from her legal residence, had disposed of her property without permission, and had threatened her with arrest on false pretenses. He said this constituted elder abuse under Washington state law, illegal eviction, and potentially elder financial exploitation given Cameron's documented attempts to access my assets. Cameron tried to interrupt, but Vincent held up his hand. He said if Cameron did not immediately return my house keys and vacate the premises within 72 hours, he would file criminal charges and seek an emergency restraining order. Furthermore, Vincent had already contacted Adult Protective Services about the situation. That's when Jennifer appeared in the doorway, her voice shrill, saying this was all a misunderstanding. She claimed they'd just been trying to help me, that I'd agreed to move to Sunrise, that they thought I wanted this. She actually had tears in her eyes, fake ones. I could tell after knowing her for 26 years. Vincent asked if they had any signed documentation showing I'd agreed to move. Jennifer said no, but that I'd been confused lately, that I wasn't thinking clearly. One of the officers asked if I seemed confused now. I looked him straight in the eye and recited my full name, birth date, social security number, current address, and the exact date and amount I'd paid for this house, June 15, 1978, for $87,000. The officer turned back to Cameron and said I seemed perfectly lucid to him. That's when Diane came to the door, this woman who supposedly couldn't handle stairs, couldn't live alone, needed immediate family care. She took one look at the police and Vincent's briefcase full of legal documents, and suddenly remembered she had somewhere else to be. She told Jennifer she wasn't feeling well, that maybe she should go back to her own house, after all. Vincent handed Cameron a formal notice. It gave him and his entire family 72 hours to remove themselves and all their belongings from my property. If they failed to comply, the police would remove them and they'd be arrested for criminal trespassing. Additionally, Vincent was filing a civil suit for illegal eviction, elder abuse, attempted financial exploitation, and the $53,000 Cameron had spent on improvements without my authorization. Cameron's face went from white to gray. He asked where they were supposed to go with only 72 hours' notice. Vincent's response was ice cold. He said perhaps Cameron should have considered that before throwing his elderly mother onto the sidewalk with even less notice. The officers told Cameron to hand over the keys immediately. With shaking hands, he pulled them from his pocket and gave them to me. My keys, to my house, that I should never have had to fight to keep. Vincent asked if the officers could escort me inside to assess any damage and ensure my belongings could be secured. They agreed. As we walked through my front door, I saw Jennifer frantically texting, probably trying to reach David and Sarah, trying to spin this before I could tell them what really happened. But I was already 10 steps ahead of her. I'd sent both my other children detailed emails from Vincent's office that morning, with photos of all the documents Cameron had prepared, copies of the fake paperwork they'd tried to get me to sign, and a full explanation of what was happening. I'd asked them not to respond until it was over so Cameron wouldn't know they knew. My phone buzzed as we walked through the house. Text messages from David and Sarah. Mom, we're getting on the first flights home. Don't worry. We love you. We believe you. For the first time since this nightmare began, I let myself breathe. The next 72 hours were chaos, but controlled chaos, with Vincent orchestrating every move. He'd been through situations like this before, elder abuse cases, where family members tried to steal property from aging parents, and he knew exactly how to protect me. That first night, after the police escorted Cameron and his family out temporarily so I could secure my home, Vincent arranged for a locksmith to come immediately and change every lock, not just the doors, but the garage, the gates, the shed, everything. He also had a security company install cameras at every entrance. Cameron had shown what he was capable of, and Vincent wasn't taking chances that he might try to break in. I stayed in a hotel that night. Vincent said it wasn't safe to be alone in the house until Cameron's family was fully moved out, just in case they tried something desperate. Sarah called me from the Denver airport, crying, telling me she was so sorry she hadn't seen what was happening, that she should have visited more often. I told her there was no way she could have known. Cameron had been very careful to hide his true intentions whenever his siblings were around. David called from Tokyo, his voice shaking with anger. He said he'd always thought Cameron was immature with money, but he'd never imagined his brother could do something like this to our mother. He said he was on a 14-hour flight and would come straight to my house from the airport. The next morning, I returned home with Vincent. Cameron and Jennifer were there with a moving truck, packing up their belongings. Their faces were hard and bitter. The 3 grandchildren, my grandchildren, ages 19, 17, and 14, looked confused and upset. The youngest, Emma, tried to hug me, but Jennifer pulled her away sharply and told her not to talk to me. That hurt worse than anything Cameron had done. Those children had lived in my house their entire lives. I'd made them breakfast before school, helped with homework, attended every recital and game, and now their parents were teaching them that I was the enemy. Cameron wouldn't look at me. He just kept moving boxes, his jaw clenched, while Jennifer shot me venomous looks. At one point she hissed that I was ruining their lives, that I was being cruel and vindictive, that family was supposed to forgive each other. I almost laughed at the irony. She wanted me to forgive them for trying to steal my house and throw me out like garbage, but she couldn't forgive me for defending what was legally mine. Vincent stood beside me the entire time, documenting everything with photos and notes. When Cameron tried to take furniture that Walter and I had bought 40 years ago, Vincent calmly informed him that removing any property belonging to me would constitute theft and he'd have the police there in 5 minutes. Cameron put the furniture back. On the 3rd day, David and Sarah both arrived. David walked through that door and hugged me so tight I thought my ribs might crack. He looked at Cameron with pure disgust and said he couldn't believe they were related. Sarah was quieter, but her anger was just as fierce. She went through the house with me, documenting everything Cameron had changed or damaged over the years without my permission. We discovered Cameron had taken out a $20,000 loan using the house's address and forged utility bills as proof of residence. He'd opened credit cards in the property's name. He'd been telling contractors he owned the house and charging improvements to accounts he'd created without my knowledge. The financial exploitation went far deeper than I'd realized. Vincent filed a comprehensive lawsuit that afternoon. Elder abuse, financial exploitation, illegal eviction, attempted fraud, theft of services. The list went on and on. He also filed for a restraining order requiring Cameron to stay at least 500 feet away from me and the property, unless for court-ordered matters. Cameron's response came through his lawyer, a young man who clearly didn't know what he was dealing with. The lawyer sent a letter claiming Cameron had made improvements to the house in good faith, believing it would be his inheritance, and that I'd verbally promised him the property many times over the years. They wanted me to reimburse Cameron for 26 years of caretaking services and the $53,000 in improvements. Vincent laughed when he read it. He said Cameron's lawyer was grasping at straws, that verbal promises about future inheritance don't override current legal ownership, and that Cameron living rent-free for 26 years was compensation enough for any minor maintenance he'd done. As for the improvements, since they were done without the property owner's consent, and the money was taken without authorization, that was textbook theft. But the legal battle was just beginning. What I didn't expect was how ugly it would get publicly. Jennifer started posting on social media about how I'd cruelly kicked out my innocent son and his family with no notice, making them homeless. She posted photos of the grandchildren looking sad, with captions about how heartless I was for putting my selfishness above my own flesh and blood. People who didn't know the full story started commenting, calling me terrible names. Some of the neighbors who'd seen me on the sidewalk believed Jennifer's version, that I was a confused old woman who'd been manipulated by a greedy lawyer into turning on my loving family. Mrs. Chen from across the street stopped me at my mailbox one morning and told me she was disappointed in me. That family should come first. That Cameron had always been such a good son, mowing my lawn and helping me with the house. I tried to explain what really happened, but she'd already made up her mind. She walked away shaking her head. That's when I learned one of the hardest lessons of this whole nightmare. People will believe what they want to believe. And an old woman's truth is easily dismissed when there's a younger, more charismatic person telling a different story. But I had something Jennifer didn't have on social media. I had documentation. I had Vincent's legal filings, which were public record. I had photos of my belongings in trash bags on the sidewalk. I had bank statements showing the stolen money. I had the quitclaim deed Cameron had prepared without my knowledge. Sarah, who's much better with technology than I am, created a simple document with the facts and the evidence, and she posted it online. She explained that I was the sole owner of the house, that Cameron had tried to force me out and steal my property, that there was an active lawsuit with documented proof of everything. The narrative started to shift. People who'd defended Cameron went quiet. Some even apologized to me. But the damage to my reputation in the neighborhood had been done, and I knew it would take years to fully repair. The worst part was losing my grandchildren. Cameron and Jennifer poisoned them against me completely. They refused to let them have any contact with me, said I was dangerous and manipulative. These children I'd loved and helped raise now believed I'd destroyed their family for no reason. Late one night, lying in the bed I'd shared with Walter, I wondered if it was worth it, if maybe I should have just signed over the house, moved to that senior living place, let Cameron win. At least I'd still have my grandchildren. At least the neighborhood wouldn't whisper about me. But then I thought about Walter, about everything we'd built together, about the principle of the thing. I thought about all the other elderly people out there being abused by their own families, too scared or too tired to fight back, and I knew I couldn't give up. Cameron had counted on me being too weak, too confused, or too afraid of losing my family to stand up for myself. He'd gambled everything on the assumption that blood would make me surrender. He'd gambled wrong. And now we were heading to court, where he'd have to face the consequences of trying to destroy his own mother. Approximately 900 words. The court date arrived 6 weeks after Cameron threw me out on that sidewalk. 6 weeks of lawyers, depositions, sleepless nights, and watching my family fracture beyond recognition. David and Sarah stood firmly by my side. They'd seen all the evidence, knew exactly what Cameron had done. But Cameron's family had circled the wagons, and the battle lines were drawn. We arrived at the courthouse early on a gray Seattle morning. Vincent was with me, along with David and Sarah. Cameron came with Jennifer and their lawyer, that young man who still seemed to think he could spin this situation. What Cameron didn't bring was confidence. I could see it in the way he avoided eye contact, the way his hands shook slightly as he signed in at the courthouse desk. The hearing was in front of Judge Margaret Aldrich, a woman in her late 60s who'd spent 30 years handling family law and elder abuse cases. Vincent had told me she'd seen everything and didn't tolerate people who exploited vulnerable family members. I watched her face as she reviewed the case file before we began, and I saw her eyebrows rise more than once. Cameron's lawyer went first, trying to paint a picture of a devoted son who'd cared for his aging mother for decades, who'd maintained her property and managed her affairs out of love and duty. He claimed I'd promised Cameron the house multiple times, that everyone in the family understood it would be his inheritance, that he'd invested his own money and time improving the property based on that understanding. Then he made his biggest mistake. He suggested that I was experiencing cognitive decline, that I'd become paranoid and irrational, that my accusations were the result of confusion and manipulation by opportunistic attorneys who saw a wealthy elderly woman as a source of fees. Judge Aldrich stopped him there. She asked if he had any medical documentation supporting claims of cognitive decline. He admitted he didn't. She asked if he had any witnesses who could testify to specific incidents of confusion or impairment. He said Jennifer would testify about my forgetfulness and confusion. Then, it was Vincent's turn, and I watched my attorney dismantle Cameron's case, piece by piece, with the precision of a surgeon. First, Vincent presented my property deed from 1978, along with 47 years of continuous tax payments, all in my name. He showed the prenuptial agreement from 1963, clearly stating that any property I owned before marriage would remain separate. He presented Walter's will, which mentioned the house 0 times because Walter had no legal claim to leave it to anyone it wasn't his to bequeath. Then Vincent presented the documents I'd found in Cameron's office, the quitclaim deed prepared without my knowledge, the mortgage pre-approval letters for a property Cameron didn't own, the emails to financial advisors discussing how to access mother's real estate, equity, the applications for credit cards and loans using my property as collateral without authorization. Judge Aldridge's expression grew colder with each document. Vincent then addressed the cognitive decline claims. He presented letters from Dr. Martinez, my physician of 15 years, stating I was mentally sharp and showed no signs of dementia or impairment. He presented a cognitive assessment I'd voluntarily taken 2 weeks prior, scoring in the 97th percentile for my age group. He even had the neurologist's report stating my brain function was exceptional for 82 years old. Then came the evidence of financial exploitation. Bank records showing Cameron had been withdrawing money from my household account money. I'd given him access to only 4 utilities and minor repairs and spending it on personal expenses and unauthorized renovations. $53,000 over 3 years. Cameron had been treating my account like his personal piggy bank. Vincent presented the photographs from that terrible Friday. Me sitting on the curb surrounded by trash bags, my belongings scattered on the sidewalk, Diane's luxury SUV pulling up with her 20 Louis Vuitton suitcases while I sat there humiliated in front of my neighbors. The judge studied those photos for a long time. When she looked up at Cameron, her face was hard as stone. Then came witness testimony. David testified that Cameron had lied to him about my mental state, had told him I was getting confused and forgetful when David's own weekly phone calls with me showed no such thing. Sarah testified that Cameron had deliberately scheduled the eviction during the 1 week both siblings would be out of the country and unreachable. Vincent called Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor from 2 doors down, who testified she'd watched Cameron throw my belongings onto the curb while I sat there crying. She said she'd known me for 20 years and I'd always been sharp, kind, and completely independent. She admitted she'd believed Jennifer's social media posts at first but felt terrible once she learned the truth. Then came Cameron's testimony, and I watched my son try to justify the unjustifiable. He claimed he'd honestly believed the house was his, that he'd made that assumption based on family conversations over the years. He said he'd never meant to hurt me, that he'd only been trying to help by finding me a nice senior living place. Judge Aldridge asked him directly, even if he'd honestly believed the house would someday be his, what gave him the right to physically remove me and my belongings without my consent? Cameron stammered something about Diane needing the space urgently. The judge asked about Diane's medical emergency. Cameron couldn't provide any medical records. He admitted Diane wasn't actually in critical condition, just that Jennifer wanted her mother close by. Judge Aldridge leaned forward and asked the question that cut through all the excuses. Why hadn't Cameron simply asked me if Diane could stay temporarily? Why had force and deception been his first resort with his own mother? Cameron had no answer for that. He just sat there, finally silent, finally out of justifications. Then Jennifer took the stand, and she was worse. She actually tried to claim I'd been cruel to her over the years, that I'd made her feel unwelcome in their home, that I'd been controlling and difficult. Vincent calmly asked if the home where she'd lived rent-free for 26 years, where I'd helped raise her children and paid for their private school tuition, had been such a terrible place to live. Jennifer went quiet. Judge Aldridge called for a 30-minute recess to review all evidence. Those 30 minutes felt like hours. I sat in the hallway with David and Sarah, their hands holding mine, and I prayed that justice would prevail. Not revenge. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted what was rightfully mine protected, and I wanted my son to understand that what he'd done was wrong. When we returned, Judge Aldridge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. She stated clearly that I was the sole legal owner of the property, that Cameron had no ownership claim whatsoever, that his residency had been as a guest at my discretion. She found his actions constituted illegal eviction, elder abuse, and financial exploitation. The restraining order Vincent had requested was granted. Cameron had to stay 500 feet from me and my property. Then came the financial judgment. Cameron was ordered to repay every penny of the $53,000 he'd stolen, plus interest. He was ordered to pay my legal fees. He was ordered to pay punitive damages for the emotional distress and elder abuse. Judge Aldridge looked directly at Cameron and said something I'll never forget. She told him that betraying a parent's trust was one of the lowest forms of family abuse, that his actions were particularly egregious because he targeted someone who'd given him nothing but love and support for 54 years. She said his assumption that his mother was too old or too confused to fight back was both morally reprehensible and, as it turned out, catastrophically incorrect. Cameron's face crumbled. For the first time through this entire ordeal, I saw what might have been genuine remorse. but it was too late. The damage was done. As we left the courthouse, reporters were waiting. Vincent had quietly notified media about the case because elder abuse was a growing problem and he wanted to raise awareness. I gave a brief statement about how senior citizens should never be afraid to stand up for their rights, no matter who's trying to take advantage of them. That night, the story was on local news. Elderly mother wins court battle after son attempts property theft. The narrative Jennifer had tried to create on social media was completely destroyed by the court's findings. But standing in my house that evening, victory felt hollow. I'd won the legal battle, kept my home, gotten justice, but I'd lost my oldest son and 3 grandchildren in the process. That's a price no court judgment can compensate. 3 months have passed since that courthouse victory, and I'm sitting here in my living room, in my house watching the autumn rain fall on the garden Walter and I planted 40 years ago. The roses are still blooming, late-season survivors that refuse to quit despite the cold. I suppose we have that in common. The legal battle is over. Cameron paid back the $53,000, though I know he had to take out loans to do it. The restraining order is still in effect for another 9 months. Vincent told me Cameron tried to appeal the judgment, but his lawyer convinced him it was hopeless. The evidence was too clear, the law too straightforward. You can't steal your mother's house and claim you thought it was yours when 47 years of documentation proves otherwise. I revised my will the week after the court decision. Vincent sat with me in his office, and we went through everything carefully. The house goes to David and Sarah equally. Cameron gets nothing from my estate except a single dollar. Vincent said that's important legally, to show he wasn't accidentally forgotten but deliberately excluded. My investment accounts, my savings, everything Walter and I built together, will be split between my 2 younger children and their families. It hurt to write Cameron out completely. Even after everything he did, he's still my son. I still remember the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard and call them roses. I still remember teaching him to ride a bike on this very street. Remember his high school graduation. Remember holding his first child, my first grandchild, minutes after she was born. Those memories don't disappear just because someone betrays you. But I also learned something important. At 82 years old, love doesn't mean letting people destroy you. Forgiveness doesn't require putting yourself back in harm's way. I can love the child Cameron once was while accepting that the man he became is someone I need to protect myself from. The hardest part has been losing my grandchildren. Emma, Jackson, and Sophie. I raised them as much as Cameron and Jennifer did. I was there for first days of school, taught them to bake Walter's famous chocolate chip cookies, read them bedtime stories when their parents worked late. Now they won't speak to me. Cameron and Jennifer have convinced them I'm some kind of monster who destroyed their family over greed and spite. Emma turned 15 last month. I sent her a birthday card with a check, just like I'd done every year of her life. It was returned, unopened, with refused written across the envelope in Jennifer's handwriting. I kept that envelope in my desk drawer. Someday, when Emma's old enough to hear the truth, maybe she'll understand, or maybe she won't. That's not something I can control. David comes by twice a week now. He moved back to Seattle from Portland, took a transfer with his company specifically to be closer to me. He says he regrets all those years living far away, wishes he'd been here to see what Cameron was doing. I tell him there's nothing he could have done, that Cameron was very careful to hide his intentions. But having David nearby has been a gift. We have dinner together, talk about his kids, laugh about old memories of Walter. He helps me with things around the house, not because I can't do them myself, but because he wants to spend time with me. Sarah visits once a month from Denver, stays for long weekends. She's started a blog about elder abuse awareness, using my story with my permission to help other seniors recognize the warning signs. She's heard from dozens of elderly people who went through similar situations with their own children, and many of them didn't have the resources or documentation to fight back. Some lost everything. Reading their stories breaks my heart and makes me grateful. I had Vincent, had those property documents, had the strength to stand up for myself. The neighborhood eventually learned the truth. After the court decision was publicized, several neighbors apologized to me. Mrs. Chen brought me homemade dumplings and cried, saying she was sorry for judging me without knowing the facts. I forgave her. She'd only heard one side of the story, and Jennifer had been very convincing. Now when I walk down the street, people wave and smile. Some have even asked for Vincent's contact information, saying they have elderly relatives in similar situations who need help. I still sleep in the bedroom I shared with Walter. Some nights I talk to him, tell him about everything that happened. I think he'd be proud that I fought back, but devastated that it came to this with our oldest son. Walter always saw the best in people, sometimes to a fault. He would have wanted to believe Cameron could change, could apologize, could make things right, but I'm more practical after all these years. Some people only learn lessons they're forced to learn, and some never learn at all. My health is good. Dr. Martinez says I'm doing remarkably well for 82, especially considering the stress of the past 6 months. My blood pressure is stable, my mind is sharp, and I'm still doing yoga twice a week with a group of women from my bridge club. One of them, Margaret, is 79 and going through something similar with her daughter. I've been able to give her advice, connect her with Vincent, help her understand she's not alone. Turning my pain into something that helps others gives it meaning. I've started writing down stories about Walter and our life together. Not for publication, just for David and Sarah and their children. I want them to know who their grandfather was, what he built, how hard he worked, how much he loved his family. I want them to understand that the wealth Cameron tried to steal wasn't just money and property, it was decades of sacrifice and smart decisions and partnership between two people who built something together. The money Cameron took, it's being paid back in monthly installments that will take him 5 years to complete. Every month, that payment arrives, and every month I put it into investment accounts for David's and Sarah's children. Cameron's own kids won't see a penny of his inheritance, not because I'm cruel, but because he has no inheritance coming. The money he stole will educate his siblings' children instead. There's a certain poetry in that. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just signed those papers Cameron and Jennifer put in front of me. If I'd moved to Sunrise Senior Living, given them the house, let them win, I'd probably still have a relationship with my grandchildren. Cameron would be speaking to me, even if it was fake. The family would appear intact from the outside. But I'd know the truth. I'd know I'd surrendered everything Walter and I built because I was too tired or too scared to fight. I'd know I'd let my son steal from me and gotten away with it. And that knowledge would have poisoned whatever years I have left. At 82, I don't have time for relationships built on lies. I don't have energy for people who see my age as weakness. I'd rather spend my remaining years with the children who love me for who I am, who respect what I've accomplished, who understand that being old doesn't mean being helpless. The roses Walter and I planted are blooming their last blooms of the season. Tomorrow I'll cut them and bring them inside, preserve them before the frost kills them. That's what you do when you're a survivor. You save what you can, you protect what matters, and you don't apologize for refusing to let people destroy what you've built. Cameron made a terrible gamble. He bet that his elderly mother would be too confused, too weak, too afraid of losing her family to fight back. He thought 82 years old meant powerless. He confused my kindness over 26 years with stupidity. But I'm Ruth Patterson. I survived the Great Recession with my investments intact. I negotiated real estate deals in the 70s when women weren't taken seriously in business. I raised 3 children, buried a husband, and rebuilt my life at 77. I've got 8 decades of wisdom, strength, and stubbornness running through these old veins. And that's something Cameron should have remembered before he put my belongings in trash bags and threw me out like garbage. This house still stands. I still stand. And every morning when I wake up in the home Walter and I built together, I'm reminded that justice sometimes takes 82 years to learn how to fight for 'em, but it's never too late to stand up for what's right. If this story touched you, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. I read every single one, and it means the world to know I'm not alone in this. There are grandmothers and grandfathers everywhere fighting similar battles, and we need to support each other. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because there are more stories like mine that need to be told. Stories of seniors who refused to be victims, who stood up for themselves, who proved that age brings wisdom and strength, not weakness. And if you're going through something similar, if someone in your family is trying to take advantage of you because they think you're too old to fight back, please find help. Talk to a lawyer who specializes in elder law. Document everything. And remember, you're never too old to defend what's rightfully yours. Walter would have wanted me to end this with something he used to say. The best revenge is living well and living honestly. So that's what I'm doing. Living in my house, surrounded by memories of a beautiful life, protected by the children who truly love me, and grateful for every single day I get to wake up and choose strength over surrender. Cameron learned that you should never underestimate a grandmother who knows exactly what she owns and isn't afraid to fight for it. And if there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this: respect your elders, not because they're weak and need your pity, but because they're strong and deserve your honor. We've survived decades you haven't lived yet, and that's not something to dismiss, it's something to celebrate. Thank you for listening to my story. Now go hug your grandmother and treat her like the warrior she is.